Well, hello everyone. So welcome to this episode of Let Me Review That For You. I'm your host, Lee. And so in this episode, I actually want to talk about camera choices. 35mm SLR manual focus camera choice between two cameras. And so right here in front of me, we have the Olympus OM-2n and Olympus OM-1. Both of the cameras have their own advantage and disadvantage. Really entirely the choice is actually kind of easy to make once you know exactly what you want to achieve with your film photography experience. So let's start with the OM-1. They came out with the OM-1 in the early 70s because Olympus wants to make a camera that's compact and breaks away from the normal image of the 35mm SLR, which is big, bulky, and very cumbersome to carry. So they came out with this beautiful OM-1, which they managed to shrink the camera size, the SLR camera size, by 30% by redesigning the shutter mechanism to the front of the camera right here, through reducing the cluster in the top and reducing the thickness of the camera and overall camera profile by 30% compared to a lot of the SLR cameras back in the early 70s. And as soon as Olympus released the OM-1, every other manufacturer starts to come out with their own design of small, compact 35mm SLR cameras. And that's actually, personally, I think what started the revolution of the manual focus, more compact SLR film cameras back in the days, which for that, really kudos to Olympus for a revolutionary design. The OM-1 is a full manual focus camera with manual mechanical shutter. What's the advantage? That is, you don't need a battery to operate this camera. As long as you know some of the basic exposure compensation or knowledge, you should be able to use this camera without any batteries, provided your experience or your results would highly depend on your experience in film photography. So that is also the disadvantage, because if you don't have a battery, you might not have a accurate exposure when your film comes out. They might be way overexposed or they might be way underexposed because of the lack of the experience. Now, don't worry, because Olympus thought about that and they actually cramped a electronic metering system in the camera, through the lens metering system, okay? Pretty good thought for that, and that actually fixes your worry. And with that system, all you need is a button cell. You need a supposedly 1.35 volt mercury battery to power that light meter in here. But don't worry, because any modern 1.5 volt battery would do just fine. I tested the meter personally myself compared to the fairly newer OM-2, which is fully electronic, by the way. The light meter actually reads very comparable results. And I even tested this light meter with my iPhone, because I have an app that actually serves as an external light meter for me sometimes if I don't have a light meter with me. The results are very comparable, like within half a stop difference. And a lot of times actually the meter are actually spot on. They give the exact same readings. So in that regards, this camera actually does give you a fairly good exposure experience, provided if you have a battery installed. Okay, so the internal light meter works just fine. It gives you a basic plus, minus, or right on the spot gauge, so you know what your correct aperture setting and what your correct shutter speed setting would be. In turn, that would give you actually a very accurate exposure, provided everything is manual. So you gotta turn a lot of dials in order to make a good exposure with the OM-1. And so in that regards, if you like manual exposure experience, you like everything manual, you like turning dials, you should definitely go with the Olympus OM-1. What this camera is not good for is if you're shooting people, if you're shooting on the street photography, or if you're shooting stuff that actually moves quite a lot, the camera is going to take time to manually focus. After you manually focus, it also takes time to adjust the shutter speed and your aperture to get that correct exposure. Now, in that time that you spend adjusting those, your moment might have already be lost. So in that regard, I do not recommend this camera for works that involves fast-moving subjects or people. For architectural photography, for landscape, general purpose use, any stuff that doesn't move, and you have a ton of time to kill, this camera, the Olympus OM-1, is the perfect camera for you. You're gonna enjoy that experience, taking your time to compose the shot. And yes, get this camera right away, okay? Now, on to the Olympus OM-2 and OM-2n. Which camera is this good for? Now, this camera is very good for me because I like my camera to have an automatic exposure, be it shutter priority or aperture priority, but personally, I like aperture priority. Now, I am a photographer. I make my living doing photography for clients. And most of the time, I would say 99.9% of the time, I'm actually shooting aperture priority exposure. Now, for my subjects on outdoor shootings, portrait photography, aperture priority is my personal choice. I like to know that I get a good separation using a very shallow depth of field while I'm out on the shooting with my fast prime lens, again, on my digital cameras. And aperture priority is very, very good in that regard. Now, this camera, it's a manual focus camera. It does give you aperture priority, so that actually takes the worry of the exposure out of the way when you're out on the street and composing. So you don't have to worry about the shutter speed. All you have to worry about is your aperture. And that is your important creative control as well, because with a better lens, with a faster lens, you can control the background blurriness, which is controlled by your aperture. So in that regard, it gives you an important creative control on the depth of field. That is manual. And that is entirely dependent on the aperture that you're going to give it. The other thing you can control here is, of course, your focus. Now, if you want to shoot people on the street, again, manual focus is going to take time. But hopefully, once you get good to manual focusing, you should have a fairly good, fast workflow with a manual focus lens as well. So that is the only thing you have to worry about on this camera when you're out on the street shooting people. Can you use this camera to shoot everything else? Absolutely. In that regards, I think as a general use camera, the OM-2/OM-2n should always be a better choice compared to the OM-1 because it's just so much more versatile, because it gives you more creative control, it gives you more options in that regards. Now, the downside is it's very battery dependent. You need a battery for this to work. It takes a modern 1.5 volt battery, so that's not a concern. So when I go out on the street and shooting with my OM-2n, I always have an extra battery with me, and those little button batteries doesn't take any space at all. And the good thing about this camera is I know it's battery dependent. That's why they give you a battery indicator light. So when you turn the battery check, and if the light is actually red, it's solid red, it should be able to last you a couple rolls of film without any problem. The light would actually flicker. That means the battery is actually running low on this camera, and you should probably replace the battery soon. But even so, you should still be able to shoot at least a roll of film without any worry. Nowadays, with film photography, at least for me, I don't shoot that many films, that many rolls of films. So it's really not a concern. And in that regard, I would actually recommend the OM-2n for the most part for everybody. Okay, so, but that is actually one of the downside of the 2n is it's battery dependent. If there's no battery, you can't shoot. That situation happens, but how often it happens, I would say less than 0.1% of the time, nowadays at least. And so this is definitely a better camera. Personally, for me, it's a better camera. Are those cameras perfect? Absolutely not. All those cameras actually have some quirks. Now, both of those cameras don't have an off button. So if you're out, if you give this camera to other people to play around and they don't know, they actually press the shutter while you have films loaded, it's gonna waste that roll of film, okay? I mean, that frame of film, because the camera doesn't have an off button to prevent the camera from firing. Other cameras, say a Minolta, a modern day camera, it's got an off button. So if you cock the film and you have the camera in the off position, it doesn't fire. And if you turn it on, it's gonna fire. So that is the difference. I wish they had an off button over here, but they don't. So that's one quirk that I don't like about those cameras. Very easy to accidentally press the shutter button. But according to Olympus, they designed the camera to be always on for professionals, so you don't miss an important shot. You know, the opinion is yours, but I think without an off button, it's kind of not good, okay? Back in the days, it's really hard to implement a exposure lock function. Without exposure lock, I think, especially for aperture priority, sometimes your workflow could get slow a little bit because those cameras are center weighted, so they only metering for the center part of the frame, and sometimes if your subject is off on the side, your exposure is going to be off. It's going to be underexposed or overexposed because it's only metering for the background. Now, for the OM-2n or OM-2, the advantage is, even though without a exposure lock, you're able to do exposure compensation on the spot with a dial on the top. Okay, right here. So that's an exposure compensation. So you have +2 up to -2 on here, which is really great for the OM-2, and that's the reason I recommend the OM-2 over OM-1, because it's got a very easy exposure compensation. So if you are shooting with center-metered waitering and your subject is on the side and your background is way bright, you can just turn the exposure compensation to +1 to +1.3 in that regards, and you're gonna correctly expose your subject on the side, which might already be underexposed on your OM-1 according to the meter, because it doesn't have an exposure compensation. You can turn this dial to compensate. This is an ISO dial. However, this dial is cumbersome to operate because it requires pressing of the button and another finger to rotate the dial. Very slow to do, but it's a manual exposure camera. So what you can do alternatively on the OM-1 is you just gotta know that you are exposing for the center, not the subject, and you gotta turn your shutter speed slightly slower to compensate, as opposed to turn the dial a couple of clicks away. So in each camera, you're able to achieve that exposure lock, but you're gonna achieve it slightly slower. But in that regard, how you achieve it is different, but you can still achieve the same results as to a modern camera, say the Minolta X570, which actually had a exposure lock built-in, which is much faster to operate. And it's one of the downside. Those cameras, and since they are coming out in the 70s, one important thing that I want to mention before I close up this chapter is those cameras are both affected by a serious problem with the foam that they used for the top of the camera that actually damages the focusing prism inside the camera. I actually have a link on the top if you're interested on how to service the prism and how to clean out that foam on those cameras, but they are actually plaguing quite a lot of those Minolta OM-1 and OM-2 cameras back in the days, and chances are, if you're getting it nowadays in year 2022, you're gonna run into this problem eventually if you don't have that problem. And you might have that problem if you bought a OM-1 and OM-2. The easiest way to find out is look through the viewfinder. You're gonna see some damage on the bottom part of the viewfinder that kind of looks like mold, kind of looks like spotted area, like silver area in the viewfinder. If you see those, your camera is actually affected. And it's actually a fairly simple fix if you're fairly good with DIY, do-it-yourself kind of a person. Just involves a few specialized tools, some rubbing alcohol. You can easily get that foam removed on the top and even get that prism removed and replaced using a donor camera from the newer days of the Olympus manual focus cameras. But again, I'll have a link on the top if you guys are interested on how to fix those. Otherwise, the decision on which camera to pick is entirely up to you. If you like manual experience, everything manual, pick the OM-1. You're gonna enjoy using this camera. But if you want a slightly easier shooting experience where you just want to worry about pressing the shutter at the right moment and controlling the depth of field, controlling the background blurriness, go with the OM-2n. And before I wrap up, I also want to mention that Olympus Zuiko lenses are fantastic. You're gonna get some really nice results, and you're not gonna spend a lot of money except some very hard to find Olympus Zuiko lenses. My personal choice or my personal favorite on the lenses choice are, I like the 28mm, which is not overly too wide, and it's great for street photography if you want to photograph some of the buildings, if you want to photograph some of the surroundings with your subject in the frame. And the 35mm are also a great general street photography choice. You can get some pictures of the buildings, but you kind of have to go a little bit further away from your building. But the 35 is great for integrating your subject with a fairly nice blurry background if you want that kind of a nice looking effect. And also good for grabbing, general on the move street photography. So 35mm is, again, one of my personal choice. The one you see here is a 35 f2, kind of hard to find, more expensive lens to get, but you can get a 35 f2.8 for less than $100 for sure. That would be a great lens to get. Over here, usually you're gonna find is a 50mm. The 50mm are very affordable. You can get f1.4, f1.8. Those lenses are so common, and you can get them usually for less than $50 for a really good pair of 50mm Zuiko lenses. There are different generations of the lens, but it's a very good lens for portraits. Okay, you can get a beautiful blurry background, separate your subject on the street, and get that nice bokeh blurred background effect if you want. The 1.4 are great for low light, 1.8 great for general photography, and it's just pretty good for low light if you have an ISO 400 film or a more higher sensitivity film that you want to use. The 50mm is actually pretty great lens to use. Over here I have a specialty lens, which is actually a telephoto lens. Look at how small this telephoto is, and that's a beauty of the Zuiko lens. They are able to make those lenses so compact, and this one is actually a 135 f2.8, so it's a very fast prime lens and very, very compact. It's a fun lens to use for portraits, and if you're shooting wildlife in the parks, you're definitely going to enjoy using Zuiko's telephoto lens. But for general photography, on the street shoot, you'll find abundance of Zuiko from f2.20 at 24mm f2.8 up to 50mm f1.4, all for less than $100. And sometimes you get lucky, you can find a lens with a kit that already come with a very decent lens for less than $100. Those are my experience. Depending on your country and depending on the time that you're watching this video, the price fluctuates quite a lot for those cameras. but nowadays you are still able to get into film photography for less than $100 and start enjoying, that whole photography experience. In that regards, yes, you should definitely give those cameras a try, and depending on your needs, you can get an OM-1 or OM-2 all for less than $100. If you guys have any questions about any of those cameras, feel free to ask me in the comment section down below. And I hope this video is helpful to you and in making a decision on which camera should you get when you are out in the market looking for a used one. Thanks again for watching at this video. Please do hit the thumbs up or subscribe to my channel if you found this video helpful. Otherwise, see you in the next video. Take care.